Welcome to Uprising. Each episode looks inside what it takes to lead the most dynamic and successful cultural movements. Some of them in the business world, some in the social realm, some in politics, and some in between, to see why people start uprisings, what gives those initiatives momentum and keeps them going, and most important, what lessons can you learn from these movements and how to apply them to your business and even personal life. Let's explore the secret to sparking movements that move people into action.
Passionate ideas.
Controversial ideas.
Uprising ideas.
The power is now in the hands of anyone.
To start a cultural movement.
Your movement.
To move the world.
Hello everyone, this is Scott Goodson, and welcome to a new episode of Uprising, where it is my job to deconstruct cultural movements, whether they're in the business realm or the social space, because one tends to find a lot in common around these different movements. And it's really interesting to hear how these people are shaping these movements or what kind of insights they have around how society is changing and how they're building movements as a result of those changes. Today we have a very special show with a very special guest, one of the world's foremost experts in luxury, in managing huge fashion businesses, and in the business of aesthetics. Someone who's widely regarded as someone who has broken new ground. Pauline Brown is a professor at Harvard. She most recently was the acclaimed chairman of LVMH in the United States. LVMH, of course, is the world's leading house of luxury brands, satisfying your heart's desire with everything from Louis Vuitton to Marc Jacobs, from Donna Karan to Dior, from Veuve Clicquot to Moët Chandon, Dom Perignon, and of course Hennessy. The movement that is happening today has implications for fashion and luxury brands. And I want to start the show with a question. Is there an uprising happening in fashion and luxury? Historically, trends were set and dictated top-down by magazine editors, department stores, celebrities, and socialites. But today, in this episode of Uprising, we're going to talk a lot about how trends are now being generated bottom-up through social media and via friends. If you want a better understanding of where fashion and luxury is going and what we can learn from it all, then this episode is for you. My guest is Pauline Brown, an incredible thinker and a business leader. She's a role model for a new generation of female business leaders and has an extraordinary following. She is also one of the most positive minds I've come across in any industry, and especially in fashion, which needs it, and which is perhaps why so many people come to her for advice and guidance. She sits on many boards, including the Wharton Business School, Parsons, and the Aspen Institute, and currently lectures about the business of aesthetics, which is a pioneering area of study for analytical leaders of tomorrow.
First of all, I would say that this trend extends well beyond fashion. The idea being that we don't need to have stuff. When you live in a digital age, you can represent your style and your taste and your discovery in ways other than actually owning or having it in three-dimensional form around you. And so if you apply that particular trend to fashion, I would say that the pleasure that historically came from putting things on and showing people that it looked good on you, or that you got there before anyone else, or that you got there on top of everyone else that you cared about, now you can actually represent and achieve those same positive feelings without actually going to the store and buying something. And you do it in a few different ways. One is you can actually post, right, short of owning, and the post is a form of showcasing and discovery. And the second, which is a smaller trend, but I think one that's going to have a radical effect on fashion in the years ahead, is you can rent. You can actually have an item, showcase it in 3D form in a real event, and give it back. And you had 90% of the gratification of actually wearing it and showing people that you had it without actually having to pay 100% for that item.
It's a pretty radical thought. I mean, from someone who is probably at the pinnacle of the fashion world and having spent many years in top positions and consulting lots of different brands, and to have that point of view, it's pretty radical.
Well, I think that the changes all around us are pretty radical. Many argue that the speed of change over the last, call it 10 to 15 years, is more striking and more intense than it was for hundreds of years before that collectively. I mean, the way people are expressing themselves, the way that their minds are being activated, the way they're communicating with other humans. I mean, you think about it, in a very, very short period of time, everything about the way we live has so radically changed. And this is just one, very basic place or component of the way we live. The other interesting thing which keeps fashion going is that I'd say for the last 30 years, we're in the first phase of history where the fashion that is being consumed and worn is actually not here to last. So 200 years ago, if a woman bought a dress for a tea party or a ball, and then 3, 4, 5 years later, the trend was different in terms of the neckline or the hemline or the way the waist sat, they would repurpose the dress. And, flash forward 100 years, 200 years, you would have exhibits at the Met, and you'd still have some, however frayed, but some preserved version of that 18th century, 19th century dress. Well, I would say as of about the 1960s and 70s on, this is really the first time where even high fashion items in 100 years from now will not exist because the materials that they're using cannot be preserved. There's more chemicals in the materials. They're generally not built with the kind of construction such that they could be repurposed. And that industrialization of fashion at all levels has been good for the business of fashion. It has actually been very bad for the environment. And I'd say it's been bad for the historical archives as well.
Fashion is going through this huge change. So as a thoughtful disruptor, what do you see as, we see what the crisis is, but what's the opportunity?
Well, so first of all, if you go back to why people even have had over the ages of fascination with fashion, I would say it came down to a few things, a few common human desires. One is it always represented, as you had pointed out a few moments ago, the manifestation of a tradition of craft and creativity that we still look for, but I don't think we're looking for it in fashion to the same extent. I think we're quite happy buying, the Zara knockoff of the Celine runway piece.
Right,
so the idea of having the authenticity in fashion is not as prioritized as it might be in food, for example. Right now, we're in the food world back to this sort of farm to table, the sense that I'm close to where it was all reaped, that I can actually see the food or understand the food in some raw form before it was concocted, in a laboratory, pharmaceutical style. And so, as has been the case in food, I think with fashion, there's going to be a regression back to seeing things that feel like they came from the hand, where I can actually feel the materials that went into it, where I have a connection maybe to the person who might have made it or designed it. I find it harder and harder wherever I go, whether it's in a city like Beijing or in St. Louis within the US, to find things that feel original in fashion. So when I'm looking for authenticity, when I'm looking for things that feel like they've been made by hand, I go in very different places. I would never go to a mall. I don't go into fashion clothing stores. But I'm still looking for that same thing. I'm just looking in other categories. So what I would say is, first of all, what we're seeing is because there's been this massification of ready-to-wear, a lot of the most creative minds have gone into other industries. They have not been going into fashion for some time. There are still very talented people, but they tend to be, I'd say, subjugated by the economic pressures and the commercial challenges. It's a crowded business. It's tended not to attract the most creative minds in the developed world. And so then I say, where do those creative minds go? Because it's not like we have less creativity today than we did 100 years ago. I actually think we have more. I think it goes into entertainment. I think it's gone into technology, and specifically Silicon Valley. I think a lot of that great creative energy is going into things like Instagram posts, where there's no monetization, but there's just this outpouring of creative activity. And then when I project forward, I say, but eventually these things do come full circle, much like food went, from the heydays of McDonald's to now where we would pay a premium for something that's labeled organic, that back in the day would have been seen as, just farm food, right? It would have been the cheaper version of the white bread, would be the brown bread,
Right.
because it hasn't been processed, and therefore it's not as sterile or not as modern. Now modern is feeling real and authentic and going back to nature. I think in some ways fashion will do that too, but it's going to take a while, and it'll probably take a lot of rationalizing within the industry as well.
Which kind of brings me to Iceland. I know it's a bit of a non sequitur, but you talked about not going into stores, but you have on occasion gone off the beaten track to, I believe, the Shetland Islands, to Iceland, to Haiti. And for some time, you've had an affinity, with the people of Iceland. Why is that?
A couple reasons. I mean, one is because it's such a small market and an isolated one, it's an island, it has never been a draw for big commercial interests. And nor have they depended on big commercial interests because they are pretty rich in their own resources, which is mostly fishing and geothermal energy. So you have this very unusual setup where you have sort of this sort of independent colony, what was once a colony of Denmark and now is its own people. It is a branch that is not quite like any other in their language and their customs. As you go there, you start to see, well, they're not quite, they're not Scandinavian, and they're definitely not European. And even within the Nordic, their style and their way of expressing themselves is different. And I think it's partly because of the isolation of the country, and partly because of the self-sufficiency I described a few moments ago, and partly because it's actually a very inhospitable place for humankind. There's no greenery. It's lava strewn throughout the island, so there's no natural trees. It's a harsh climate. Obviously, a good part of the year, because it's so far north, it's very dark. And because of all that, you sort of say, what's the impact on a people that have been there? They're a very homogenous people, and they're very tight, somewhat tribal in their style and their ways and their cohesiveness. Like, what does that do to them and their creativity? And net, I think it makes them a lot more adventurous than the people that we commonly see in more advanced parts of the world or more integrated parts of the world.
That's fascinating.
So, every year throughout history, the men were primarily fishermen, and they'd go out to sea. And some years, half of them wouldn't come back because to be, going for 6 months at a stretch in the North Atlantic under all sorts of inclement weather, it was extremely dangerous. So half of them wouldn't come back. And so you kind of learn in that climate to live for the day. And these people celebrate like no one I've ever seen. So I know per capita they have they're the world's biggest consumers of firecrackers, for example, fireworks. And at New Year's, the sky kind of brights up because while you're alive, you learn to just celebrate the moments. And I feel like in the world that I live in, most of the year, we don't celebrate the moments enough, and we don't take risks, and we don't treat life as this sort of Viking-like challenge to be conquered. And it's that spirit, it's that boldness, and it's that need to experiment and find color in such a dark winter life that I find very infectious.
So when you run businesses, when you have led organizations, do you bring that learning and that sort of awakening to you?
Yes.
To that?
I found my way of approaching it, first things first, is just to try to humanize what can be very dehumanizing structures for most people, and remind everyone I touch in the course of a day or a year that, they're still individually prized, individually valued and seen for who they are. I have always rejected this idea of putting people in slots. I reject it for myself. And it's kind of miraculous that with that mindset, I was actually able to even survive in most of these corporate structures. But I think that particular thought process was very important. The second piece, which connects to the earlier conversation on Iceland, do I bring some of that sense of discovery and of kind of cultural awe to it? hard because each company in a way has its own culture, right? And some of the culture is set by maybe the country where it is headquartered. Some of it's set by the personality of the founder. Some of it's set by the nature of the industry. When I said a company is like a nation, in a way, in an ideal world, I'd love to work for a company that feels like Iceland, but it probably wouldn't be a very high-functioning company, knowing what I know about the Icelandics. So I guess the real answer is something in the middle, allowing for a little bit of everything, and maybe the Icelandic team belongs in R&D and not in accounting.
So you epitomize a woman leader, contemporary woman leader. Quite unique, I must say. I mean, you have an extraordinary, positive, and empowering way of working with people. You're not a totalitarian leader like most leaders in this world. And you are a woman, which is quite unique. I mean, that must have grown out of your nature because there are just so few women in such high leadership roles in America. What do you think is the role of women leaders and disruptors in the fashion space and I guess in business in general?
Well, starting with business in general, I think one of the problems, and it was just something that I intuitively went against for much of my career, is that most women have been trained that the archetype of success in big company and big business worlds is this traditional white male figurehead. And the effect that has is you either decide as a woman that you're going to reject that path because it doesn't speak to you, it doesn't feel natural, there's no space for someone like me. So that would be option number one, which is the option many women take, which is a real shame. And the second is I'm going to become as much as is possible like that white male architect of the 1950s, who behaves in a certain way in the office and leads in a certain way and negotiates in a certain way, and then kind of comes home and either in my home life I have my real life and there's a real demarcation between my professional and my personal, so that would be one choice, or I just reject the personal because there's no room for both and it's easier for me to just become this sort of corporate icon myself. And we see many women in senior levels falling into that, what I would call a trap. And I've always felt that I can't compete with others on who they are and who I'm not. I will lose. That is not, why would I play a game where I'm already stacked? It's hard enough if I just play the way I am. So I would rather play according to who I am, use what I think of as my natural qualities, one of which being very tied into my womanhood and more sort of feminine and feminist sensibilities. And if it doesn't work, I'll never regret having been who I am.
I've known you for a number of years, and one of the strengths that I see in you, which I think is a great trait for a leader, is you are one of the most curious people I've ever met, and you always ask beautiful questions. Like you're not the exclamation point. You're this beautiful question mark, and you always you're like the curious curiouser. You just continually ask great questions. And when did that start?
I think that was in from a young age. First of all, I come from a home of thinkers, right? I'm a first generation American, as you know, Scott. All four of my grandparents were refugees in the 30s, escaping the Nazis, one side from Austria, German Jewish, of the other side, both sides Jewish. And I would say the one thing that, even though in both sets of grandparents, they had to leave everything behind, eventually making their way to America. But the one thing that they never left behind and they never stopped investing in were their minds and their skills and their ability to grow. And, I look back at myself, for example, at my kids' age, as teenagers, and I just sort of say, kids are in such a rush to grow, but the amount of knowledge and wisdom and capability that has come, even in the last 10 years when I've been in middle age, is astounding. And I would hope that it just keeps going. I never, ever want to stop growing. It's what it gives me joy. It gives me energy, going back to the earlier comments on energy. And I would say another answer to your question about where does the curiosity come from. I remember, I'm very close with my mom, and she's a good student of people and of character, of people's character. And one of the criticisms, probably the worst criticism she could make as I was growing up and we would observe, people who maybe didn't pass her high mark, was a person doesn't ask any questions, doesn't show any interests. The idea of like the worst thing you could say about someone is that they were selfish or self-involved. And, whether that was good or bad, it very early on, it made me feel like I never want to be one of those people who my mom would call selfish.
Future leadership in the fashion and luxury space is going to need to move from, say, ability to have high IQ and a high EQ to something called a high AQ, which stands for aesthetic sensibility. Can you talk a little bit about what you think is needed?
If you think about this issue of what started with IQ, which was a measure of intelligence that we lived by for many generations, and it was kind of the standard, sort of the standard marker of somebody's mental capability. And then come the 80s, 90s, with the introduction of a new theory by a psychologist, Dan Goleman, started talking about emotional intelligence, that actually IQ is good up to a certain point, which is an intelligent point, but it's not generally a genius point. But then once you get to that, kind of quite high intelligence, any additional IQ capability from there is non-additive, and in some cases even can be non-productive, because you can become, in a way, too analytical and too intellectual to be successful in traditional realms. And there was he layered on this new thought, which is that people who are highly successful have emotional, or some people called social intelligence. They have, which essentially meant that they have a good sense of self, or deep sense of who they are, that they read other people properly, that they can control their emotions. It's all the things we would associate with wisdom, right? And I think he's right. And in many a business, if you don't have that EQ, it proves to be a real limitation that comes as a big surprise to certain people who always thought that they were the smartest kid in the room. Until they realized that they weren't being rewarded anymore for what they thought was the smartest behaviors. So I kind of think we've entered into this new era where there's another type of intelligence, and it's not so much an intelligence around interaction with others, and it's not an intelligence around kind of conventional problem solving, but it's an intelligence around understanding that which is beautiful or causes pleasure or delight, or things that don't typically get measured in hard business frameworks, but that are extremely valuable in most businesses. And so, for example, fashion being kind of the epitome of one where it shouldn't exist, certainly not at the volume that it does, if you don't have great, pleasurable output and beautiful output, or clothing that provides surprise and intrigue and ways to express yourself above and beyond, your use of words and other ways to express yourself. Like fashion, really, the underpinning of it is around this notion of sort of aesthetic pleasure, right? And aesthetics, by the way, isn't just design, although we think of it largely as design. It's how the fabric feels. It's it's how it all comes together in a very 3D sensorial sense. And if I apply that notion of aesthetic intelligence to very unrelated industries, we could talk about cars, for example. Why are people so fascinated with Tesla right now? Now, part of it is what it stands for. I think a big part of it is what it symbolizes. I think part of it is the idea, ideology behind it, that you're really doing something for the environment and going against, the energy dependency that has crippled us environmentally and otherwise, politically. But some of it is just that the aesthetic representation is very exciting to certain people. And it's not just the design of the cars, although if you've driven in one, it drives beautifully and feels quite wonderful within. But it's even the markers around Tesla. It's the way that they're showcasing it in the stores. It's the element of surprise that not only do they set up their own direct-to-consumer boutiques, so to speak, but they're in malls, or now they have one in Red Hook, Brooklyn. And so they're doing everything in very unconventional ways, which is part of their expression as well. And the amount of detail that goes into creating that level of delight takes a high degree of aesthetic intelligence, and I would say an organization built around it.
Do you think now that this uprising is happening in fashion, we're going to see other brands disappear or have to radically change?
I think there's a lot of brands that don't really have heritage, right? So in a way, the power of a Chanel or an Hermes or a Cartier is all the more powerful in a world where, you have hundreds of brands that, may have the quality of them. They may not, but they may. But that maybe go back 20 years and maybe don't have the stability because they don't have strong organizations around the founding designer. So I do think we're going to have a lot come in and go out. When I look at the quality of talent coming out of the design schools today, and I sit on the board of Parsons, and I certainly pay attention to the best and brightest from a Central St. Martin's in London or from an FIT. When I look at it, I think the profile of the new generations of designers is very, very different than the profile of ones, say, when I was coming of age. And some of that will be useful in the sense that they're much more digitally literate. They're much more prone to look to technologies like 3D printing for their craft. So some of that is going to be an asset. And some of it, I think, is going to be tough for them. Because going back to this issue of, that there isn't that much more room for stuff in the market right now. So unless you're superbly talented and differentiated, right? Because you could be incredibly talented at making, leather shoes, but we don't need more leather shoes at any quality level. So the differentiation comes from the vision, from the inventiveness, the adventurousness. And that combination, by the way, of craft and forward-looking creativity is not as common as you'd think. Most of the new designers I see will fall into one bucket or the other.
If you're a fashion person and you want to be the American dingo of the future, what do you have as a personality characteristic point of view?
I think that the dingo is not going to be the one that survives for 5,000 years only to find that it becomes the dominant dog breed of the generation. But it survives 5,000 years only to find that 1% of the population has it, and that 1% couldn't imagine having any other dog. And my point being, the way it really needs to be is a collection of very fragmented lines, each of which is founded by genuinely creative people who are committed to quality output, who understand their market, and their market, by the way, could be 10,000 people, and that's fine. The idea of scale in fashion is where it gets into trouble, because the minute that you're trying to be something for everybody, then you become the gap, and then you become utterly undesirable. And aesthetics don't follow the same curve, aesthetic businesses, as industrial businesses. Most of these Silicon Valley unicorns are following much more of a sort of industrial automation model, which is not appropriate for a business that's really about inherent pleasure, it's not about function, and it's not, if anything, the growth of it is what undermines it, both because it dilutes the creativity, and it certainly dilutes the feeling of specialness, which is so important in this business. If I were going into fashion today, I would be much more prone to say, I want to have 50% market share of 2% of the population than to have 2% of market share of 50% of the population. Go deep and go sustainable. And by sustainable, I'm talking financially sustainable. Grow slowly, but grow soundly and grow for the long term. Generally, good brands, at least in these traditional businesses, they don't come about overnight, or if they do, they tend to go away overnight as well. So the part of the strength of a Chanel is when you've been around 100 years, even if you get a couple collections wrong, you've built up a lot of goodwill. And you can afford to get it wrong. You can afford to take chances because, you still have something great that is non-imitable, which is real heritage, a real story, real codes, and they're deep and they're rich. And that takes time.
Like I said before, you have this amazing curiosity. I mean, you experienced Haiti through deep passion that Donna Karen and you share with Haiti. How does a place like that change you as a thought leader in the fashion world?
There's a big gap between the state of a country like Haiti, and the one thing that you can observe everywhere you go in Haiti is that they're very prone to work and gifted really to working with their hands. And the kind of fashion that I'd like to see more of is really made with a human hand, not made with machine. But the training has not been there. And obviously the infrastructure has not been there for the Haitian people. When I look at Haiti, I look at it more to see human nature in a very raw form. These are not people who have ever left the country in most cases. And there's something very honest about what it is they produce with what they have, which is very little. But what they do have is an eye for color. They'll find, if they don't have a canvas, they'll pull a piece of paper out of an old book and they'll repurpose that for their artwork. And the resourcefulness, as well as, it is interesting to me to see their use of colors in a country that actually, for all its hardship, has a lot of vibrant colors. And similarly, if you go on another part of the world altogether, but like the Faroe Islands or Iceland, where these are very foggy countries, they're island, they're seafaring. Their use of colors is very different, tends to be very inspired by kind of the gray shades of the lava, by the sort of misty blue of the sea. I mean, this is their world, and that's how it finds its way onto a canvas. So that sort of transition from the geography, the cultural backdrop, to the artistic or other creative output is always an interesting connection for me.
So I guess the last question I have for you is, here we are at this point. You are now a Harvard professor talking about this idea of aesthetic sensibility in a business school format. Mm-hmm. How has your career brought you to this point?
The operative word in that question is point, right? This is really very much a point in a journey that keeps going. And I rarely do things because they're ends unto themselves. So I didn't start ever with in mind that I would be a teacher. And I didn't make this leap into teaching with in mind that I should be a teacher. I really was more driven by this idea that there are very few professions, and it's in total defiance to the corporate life that I led before, but there are very few professions where you're paid to think and you're paid to really take the time and the space to put your thoughts into whether it's arguments or words or other platforms of expression. And I felt like I had been going for many years and I had been taking in a lot of these disparate observations and meeting a lot of interesting people in between scores of people not so interesting. And I was sort of just squeezing in insights where I could, and with people who would listen or would share or would bounce back their own insights. And I was just kind of getting exhausted of having the pressure be on the doing and not on the reflecting. What I love about teaching is not only does it give me that space for the first time, where as long as I do this, and I've re-upped for next year as well, not only am I being rewarded for just being a good thinker and communicator, but that I have a classroom of gifted students that I can test ideas, and I can see what resonates, and I can see what doesn't. Because, one of the problems when you're in this operational mindset and you're constantly focused on the doing is, you don't really learn with as much depth. You become, the kind of learning you're doing is more learning how to operate better or organize better or manage better, right? But now I feel like I'm learning to think better, and with a certain discipline around it, where it isn't just a pastime, it isn't just kind of fun. Most big companies really don't want people to be thinking, and certainly thinking as independently as I do now, nor do they want people to be communicating as freely, because as long as you have your professional hat on, you're working in the service of the company, and there's all sorts of company agendas at play. So I guess going back to your question about why now, where does it and where does that potentially lead? What point is after this point? I feel like I'm in this very unique space where I can start to pull together many of the things that I've observed, and I can aspire to be more of a thought leader and less of an operational leader. I can experiment not only with different ideas in the classroom, but with different platforms for communicating. That's really what this chapter is allowing for.
My guest today, Pauline Brown, an incredible thinker, business leader. She's a role model to a number of young men and women, a new generation of female business leaders. She is one of the most positive minds I've ever met in an industry which really needs it. Thank you so much for sharing some of your stories. It's really fascinating.
Thank you, Scott. Thank
really
you.
Fun.
Yeah, here too. Always fun to chat with you.
Thank you for joining our Uprising today and listening to our show. If you missed the show, or if you want to find out more about who was on, or if you want to learn more about how to create your own Uprising, please go to uprisingmovements.com. You can also download this Uprising program from iTunes. Uprising was produced by Nicola Keneally and Adam Helen, with special help from Melanie Boardman, Karin Drachenberg, Philippa Freeman, Brianna Campbell, Fashad Faroudi, Mark Bruzy, Will Issam, James Politi, and Jonathan Weeks. My name is Scott Goodson, and you've been listening to Uprising. What we can learn about movements and uprisings that are shaping our world in business, in society, and in between. For more on cultural movements and movement marketing, be sure to pick up a copy of the best-selling book Uprising, How to Build a Brand and Change the World by Sparking Cultural Movements, available on Amazon.com. Music for Uprising composed by Charles Duchateau.